over this off-season, fall of 2019, spring and early summer here of 2020, I've had the opportunity to work on a number of very interesting projects with a number of really great coaches in both hitting and in pitching. And as we've now sort of moved into more of, although the season with the COVID stuff has been obviously dramatically different than what we expected, we're getting into that season, so we're kind of winding down the off-season developmental stuff. Because of the COVID, there was more time, which is nice. So most of these special cases or fun projects started in the fall, maybe October, November, and are just starting to wind down in terms of trying to elicit and create new biomechanics foundations. I want to present the first kind of case study I want to show is a pitcher. This is someone I work with, JP Glascock out in California, pitching coach. I've worked with him for a number of years. We had a couple interesting projects or athletes we were working with, so he's the point person who's implementing and obviously has the pitching expertise, which is extremely important. The ability to implement the biomechanics portion with a knowledge of the biomechanics, but also an in-depth knowledge of pitching is super important. This case study is one of the number of guys we work with. Started in October, just did our final test. We did an initial test in October. We did a secondary follow-up test in January, and then we did the last test here in June. We did 6-stop 3D motion capture, optical DLT to collect the data. Just a little bit about the player, AAA player at this point with an MLB organization on the West Coast. He's coming to JP with chronic shoulder pain. Actually had to have a Tommy John surgery in 2013 while playing for a Division I school. At this point, when he came into this in October, it was uncomfortable for him to throw long distances, like long toss. His average velocity in the bullpen was probably 81 to 84, and was always dealing with some sort of pain, even if it was minor. And just in general, kind of clunky, maybe mechanically. After the program that we put him on, some sort of like more outcome-based kind of stuff, because I'm going to show you obviously the data part, but really little to no shoulder pain at all, no elbow discomfort whatsoever. Has now been able to throw extended distances, long toss, feels good throwing. Velocity in the bullpen is now in the high 80s, with top end in the 90s, low 90s, with comfort and without throwing hard. This isn't max effort by any means. Enjoys throwing. Mechanics are just cleaner. And another important one is that he understands better how he can make adjustments and what his body's doing and not doing. So that's pretty important stuff. That just kind of gives you an idea. That's some thoughts that really JP put together based on in working with him and what he's talked to him about and where we're at. Now, the first thing I want to say, I don't want to drag this out, don't want this to be too long, but one thing before I get started into the data I want to say is when you're dealing with the higher level athletes, minor league, even single A rookie guys, all the way up through established MLB guys, in my opinion, in the vast majority of cases, there's always, I guess the exception or the outlier, but generally we're not talking about major changes, okay? And it's the small changes, but the significant changes that have the impact. And you work within the context of who they are. You're not going to create a totally new movement pattern. They've been doing this for a long time. You don't want to create a new movement pattern. What you want to do is you want to work within the context of who they are and what they do, and you want to make small but very significant changes that have impact based on what we see in the data. So obviously the data part, collecting data, producing data, that's science, right? That's objective measurement. Of course, you can have differences in how you make those measurements, and some of the calculations can be a little bit different. But generally, that's objective measurement. You can look and see how those measurements are made and whatnot. The application of this data is really much more subjective. I'm sure you can run your analytics and you can look at all the statistical, outcomes and all this stuff. But generally, it's just like medicine. When you get down to it, some surgeons are fantastic and some are okay. And the difference is not in the science and the technology and the equipment they use. The difference is in the art of surgery. So of course this is mathematical science-based stuff, but it's in the art of understanding what's important and how to apply it. Most of what we did with these athletes required little to no equipment, required little to no ballistic throwing, no heavy ball throwing, anything like that. It was mostly working on patterning and mostly working on lower body connection to upper body and very little arm. We do very little arm direct stuff. That's kind of the last part of just refining the movement. Most of the arm changes you're going to see in terms of arm path and slot and movement dynamic come from a better lower body to torso relationship. So it starts with that lower body and works its way up. All right, so let's get into the data. I'm not going to do a lengthy overview. If you have questions about this or want to get into deeper discussions about it, just contact me. All right, so let's get into this. What you're going to see here is you're going to see the first two tests. The blue is going to be the first test in October. The second, this magenta color, is the test that we did in January, and I'm going to show you what we just did. So a couple key things. The first test you can see, okay, very little lower body contribution and really a disjoint relationship between the lower body and the upper body. Really, you don't have a lot of real relationship there. Okay, so the upper body is doing a lot of work without the benefit of that lower body sling or that lower body connection and drive. And that was a big part of the arm problems that we were seeing. He's doing a lot of upper body work. It's working hard with the upper body. It's creating some dynamic with the arm, and all that kind of stuff puts that arm more at risk. In his case, and we'll look at that data in a second, but in this case, what you get is a guy who gets a little bit too much elbow flexion, about 120 degrees elbow flexion in the load dynamic, and then has to push the elbow forward, sling the elbow out, and then gets kind of a limited or even a false internal rotation, most of the speed coming from that sling action across the body. And that'll always put the elbow at more risk because you have a late prolonged supination of the forearm. Pronators aren't active, aren't helping against valgus extension, and the action of slinging is creating a higher medial load. So you've got a weaker medial position and a higher medial load. So what you'll see here in the second test, after about, 3 months or so of working, 3 to 4 months of working through stuff, you'll see, okay, the upper body still wants to initiate, foot contact is over here, but we finally started to get the lower body to contribute. Now, of course, this isn't the end of the world as long as this happens, and it happens in sequence with the load, which it does. You start to see a good relationship form between the lower body and the upper body. Of course, the upper body is overdoing, and the lower body is overdoing. The upper body is not benefiting a whole lot. But we're starting to get in a sequence where we have 0 here, right? So you're starting to see some improvement here, and you obviously see some improvement in the speed output. Let's take a look here at what a lot of the things that are causing this. So the one thing right away you're going to see here is that knee flexion and lead hip articulation, lead knee. So what you'll see in the first test is that you see a straight leg coming in, straightening at foot contact, trying to stabilize a little bit, but pretty straight at about 33 degrees, and then a lot of extension at the end. What you really want to see is a knee flexion that's somewhere more in the 45 to 50 degree range. It stabilizes in that 45 to 50 degree range early on, and then has a controlled extension as you get into the acceleration release phase of the pitch. So you'll see that in the second test, we're getting closer. We're coming in a little bit closer where you want to be, between 45 to 50 degrees. And we're stabilizing fairly well, although there's a little bit of wanting to extend, and there's a little bit of extension, but he holds pretty strong, and then a little bit more controlled on the knee extension as we go into flexion, we go into acceleration phase of the arm. Let's look here really quick. I didn't have the first test articulation, but what you'll see with the second test, it's better, but you still see a dynamic where you're an internal rotation as your foot comes into at the lead hip, as the foot comes into impact, but you lose that stability, and the athlete wants to give way and lose that articulation, that real hip pelvic rotation into the hip internal rotation, and starts to externally rotate. Not a ton. The previous test was quite a bit. I didn't grab that data, but you can see there's still that tendency to want to give into an external rotation and then try to recover with some internal rotation late. Really, ideally, what we see is there's a lot of internal rotation as the leg reaches out. Usually an athlete will come in to right around 10 degrees of internal rotation, is pretty neutral, and then stabilize in that zone before internally rotating a little bit more. Sometimes they might give away a little bit to some external rotation dynamic, but generally they're stabilizing in that internal rotation as they accelerate to release. So let's take a look at what we saw when we went to this most recent test. So let's go to our test 3. Okay, let's just move over here. Let's just look at right now the relationship between the lower body and the upper body. Okay, so well, actually, let's what does it do? Let's go to the arm, to the knee flex. Okay, so you've got in the most recent test, you've got a knee flexion that comes into foot contact here at about between 45 to 50 and stabilizes for that period within a few degrees, right around 50 degrees, which is optimal. And then you have a limited but controlled knee extension, which is what you want in that late acceleration release phase. So lead side dynamic with respect to knee flexion and knee stability, front side stability, is mountains better. Although it's subtle, it's hugely better. Okay, if we look at lead side articulation, again, remember, we're not looking for somebody to become a totally different athlete. We're looking for small but very significant changes. You see internal rotation coming in, still wants to give way a little bit, but hangs on. Now, normally you like to see it hanging on around 10-ish, plus or minus, but he's hanging on in that internal rotation. He doesn't give way into external rotation. So lead hip articulates way better. So your internal or your pelvic rotation is true transverse rotation and not pelvic or torso spinning, if that makes sense. So you're getting good articulation. So let's look back. So you got strong stability on the lead side at the knee, and then you've got good lead hip articulation. So now let's look at the relationship. Okay, so now here's your lower body contribution up here around 700 degrees per second, which is right in the norm. Strong, you still see the torso wanting to get out ahead a little bit, but rebounds, strong decel, and strong acceleration gain or speed gain with the torso, all in perfect timing. If you look over here, hip, torso, arm dynamic release over here. So what you're seeing now is really good lower body contribution and really good lower body to upper torso contribution, which is taking the demands of trying to load the arm out or minimizing, puts the arm in a much better dynamic. And I'll show you that data here in a little bit. So what I'm finding in the data is lead side stability is a big contributor to lower body speed. Okay, the relationship between peak output at the pelvis and peak output at the thoracic or the chest or the upper torso has a lot to do with how well you articulate the lead hip. So in the first gain, we saw good lead side stability or better lead side stability, but still some articulation issues with that lead hip. So we had better hip contribution, but we didn't get that good relationship between the hip and the pelvis and the thoracic. Now you have good side or even better stability, so you have really good lower body contribution, but you have great articulation now, and so you get better relationship between the lower body and the thoracic. That makes all the difference in the world, So now you have a great lower body dynamic and a really good thoracic connection, which is driving an arm path that is considerably better. So this is our current arm path. I'm going to grab this and I'll copy it. Let's take it over to look at our initial stuff. So let's look at, let's take a look here. We had arm dynamic originally where you had early elbow extension. Like I said, you had overflexion. If you look at the flexion, you have about 120 or so degrees of elbow flexion, which is too much. It's usually a good elbow flexion is in the area of about 100, 105 degrees during load dynamic. When you get an overflexion, then you usually get an early extension, and that early extension, not only you're sacrificing speed output and dynamic, but you're typically putting the elbow at a higher risk for medial stress load, and certainly lateral compression load. So you've got early extension, kind of a quasi internal rotation kind of happening, and then you get this little burst of speed at the end, but the dynamic in release is kind of more elbow extension centric or driven, and internal rotation is sort of an after effect. Now, as we improve the lead side stability, you see a cleaner elbow extension speed, and significantly more internal rotation up to 12,000. Now, 12,000 is a little out of range, and really what it is it's a little bit of a fake out, because what's happening is you've gotten better, okay, but what's happening is this internal rotation is really more a function of the arm action after release. During release is a little bit more down in here, but we're getting closer to the dynamic we want. Now, when you look at what we've accomplished over 8 to 10 months, now you have a beautiful elbow extension, all right, because we've eliminated that over flexion early release dynamic, which also impacts your horizontal abduction pattern and shoulder abduction pattern. And now we have a release speed where you've got release happening more in here around 8,000, and a much cleaner arm dynamic, which is a little bit more in the zone of what we would be looking to produce. So you can see these are subtle changes, but they're impactful changes. So what does that mean in terms of arm speed? Let's look at that. So let's look at our arm speeds. Let's get rid of this. Let's look at our arm speeds for the first two tests. So our peak arm speed. Now this is the speed at which the wrist below the hand is moving. And you can see our original test, we had a peak arm speed of about 51 miles an hour, which is not terrible, but is, it's in that zone of that sort of low to mid 80s kind of average speed. After the first 4 months or so of training, we see an arm speed that now jumps up to about mid 50s. So now you're getting a little bit more, a little bit more output, makes more sense for the types of speeds you want to be throwing. And it's coming off of a little bit better arm dynamic. So you can start to see what's happening there. Now let's go ahead and let's look at our most recent test from June. Now you see an arm speed that is in 50 knots. So we've made another about 3 to 4 mile an hour jump. Now that doesn't translate into pitch velocity, but what you're seeing is that you typically see guys throwing in the 90s consistently and regularly. Let's say in the low to mid 90s have arm speeds in around about 60 to 64 mile an hour. Guys at the top end of that, mid 60s are throwing in the high 90s. Now remember, there's a lot of factors that have to do with the direction of those speeds. So I'm not gonna get into all this today, but we looked at the direction. We look at the direction of the speed output. So you can see that just maximum speed is important, but it's like anything. In golf, you can have 100 mile an hour club head speed or 120, whatever it is, but if the face is open, that ball isn't going anywhere. So the trajectory of the speeds are also very important. So I don't get into all that, but you see a peak arm speed or wrist speed of now about 59 miles an hour as opposed to where we started about 51, 52. And that is direct result of the path. And the path is a direct result of the lower body contribution and the relationship from the lower body to the upper body affecting arm path with some minor refinements that JP did from a pitching coach perspective once all that was established here in the last few weeks or so. Okay, so let's see if we're going to look at a few other things really quick. We're going to look at really quick. I wanted to show you here. So you see, if we look at arm dynamic here, you'll see here early on. This is arm flexion and external rotation. You're going to see the first test. You can see we had an elbow extension of about 120 as we went into load, which is too much. And then what you'll see just an extension pattern occurring in that early extension, which we talked about. The follow-up test you'll see is closer to 100, and you see stability all the way through. Boom. So that's what you're seeing in a better pattern. and that has impact on our horizontal position. You can see a horizontal position on some of the initial tests of 130 or so. So that's a horizontal abduction. And, usually you like to see pitchers in that 110 to 120 range. Once you get above 120, that upper arm starts to get a little bit far behind the torso. And then typically you're going to experience a real rapid adduction torque and adduction pattern, which can be counterproductive to the load. And it can also put stress on the shoulder and the elbow and contribute to that. And then, you want that horizontal abduction, your shoulder abduction to be somewhere in that 90 to 100 range as this is all occurring. So you can see this over horizontal and over flexion occurring, and then that's starting to get better. And then let's look here at our last test. So now you got, if we go back to the arm extension, you're seeing here, you see here as we go into the load, we got about 100 degrees with a nice extension, internal rotation pattern. So the load is a little flex, but when you get into the load, the primary load dynamic, you're right at about 100, which is what we want to see. But you have better timing on elbow extension, facilitating internal rotation. And then if we look at what we see here, you're seeing still the tendency, again, this is the athlete tendencies. You still see this tendency to want to get a little bit horizontally abducted. But as we get into our load dynamics, you can see that although we still have this tendency to want to get the elbow forward, our horizontal stabilizes right at about 95 to 100 with the shoulder abduction at a little over 100 in the primary load dynamic. And then you'll see at release you're getting, in release you're getting about 120, 125 or so abduction with about a 90 degree, in that zone, about 89 degrees of horizontal, which is perfect. So like, again, there's tendencies in there. These aren't just going to go away, but the dynamic itself gets cleaned up pretty significantly with minor changes to some of the overall dynamics. So the last thing is the overall kinetic link. Although there is a little bit of tendency for the upper torso to go first, you see pelvis contributing to torso with a little bit of elbow load, which is great, and then a nice elbow extension facilitating a really nice internal rotation with a release occurring, right in that sort of peak output at about 7,000 degrees per second. So you're seeing a much better arm dynamic, mostly as a function of lower body mechanics and lower body mechanics impacting torso. So again, I think people, the first thing is you're not trying to create massive wholesale change. You're working within their context. And then the second thing is that you're not going to create a new athlete. You're going to make small changes under the umbrella of who they are and what they do. One of the things that, I get a lot is I think when you're new to the data is, the sequence has to start, like transition has to be lower body torso. It doesn't. I use the example all the way back to Greg Norman in the 90s, mid 90s when I worked with Greg. He was #1 in the world. But the guy started his transition into the downswing out of sequence, which was okay because when it mattered, when he got back into the real zone of acceleration, he was flawless. So, that was Greg's swing. He had a big archy swing. It looked like he almost looked like he cast the club. Yet he had probably one of the highest release speeds I've ever seen, even though it didn't look like he had a lot of lag. So he started out of sequence. He started with his upper torso first. So the idea is that's his swing. He was #1 in the world when we started working with him, and he had some of his best years in those mid 90s. We didn't try to change what wasn't broken, but we did try to help him maximize what he could out of where he was, and it made him even better. So I think that's the key with this stuff is that these are subtle changes, but they're significant changes. And what you do is you look inside there and you see from the ground up where those issues are. And then so what we did was simplistic. if you've participated in my webinars, you know they're very basic pattern type exercises. There's no ballistic throwing. There's no heavy weighted implement throwing. Let's look at it this way. I don't want to drag this out, but let's look at it this way. Look, overhand throwing is a stressful endeavor. Okay, we weren't designed to do it hundreds and hundreds of times in a row. We're designed to do it once or twice to try to kill an animal to put food on the table, right? We weren't designed to do it 150 times in a row. So it's a lot of load. It's a stressful endeavor for the speeds we're creating. 8 times body weight, in dynamic load on the joints, the upper extremity joints, plus or minus. It's a very stressful dynamic. So you don't need to overstress that by throwing a weighted implement on top of that at ballistic speeds. You don't need to overstress it by doing a lot of extra ballistic movement pattern. You can build speed. So you got a guy who was low to mid 80s average bullpen to now high 80s with, touching 90, 91 bullpen, right? So you've gained that speed and you gained an arm speed, actual wrist speed from 51, 52 up to about 59, 7 miles an hour of even wrist speed, with very little, you had the side work going on, but with very little additional throwing and absolutely no ballistic upper body training. I think of it this way. Look, if you're an Olympic lifter and you're trying to improve your snatch, right, ground to overhead pattern, are you doing a bunch of bicep curls and shoulder presses? Hell no. You're working on lower body explosive. Your arms have nothing to do with getting the weight over your head. It's all about lower body explosion and core strength, right? All the arms do are basically hold on to the weight and then lock it out at the top. So in pitching, it's the same thing. If you move your lower body efficiently and you drive your torso efficiently, the arm only needs moderate modification and refinement to benefit. So why overstress the extremity when it has really nothing to do with what's going on? Drive it from the big muscles, the power muscles, and their coordination to the smaller muscles of the upper body. So anyway, this first case study. I've got a bunch of case studies I'm going to try to put together for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry it was a little bit longer than I intended, but everything I do is wordy and long. I just can't help myself. I get into this stuff. If you have any questions or you want to get deeper into these concepts, just contact me. And all the thanks in the world to JP and his athlete for allowing me to present this data. And all the thanks in the world for JP for understanding this and applying it in an incredibly successful way to get great outcomes from his athletes, his pitchers.